In 1931, a mother hugged her son. But when archivist Margaret Chen zoomed in on the boy's face, something felt terribly wrong. Adjusting her reading glasses, she studied the old black and white photo that had just arrived at the Smithsonian. The image captured a tender moment. A woman in a simple dress embracing a young boy in rural Kansas during the Great Depression. The woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothes told a story of hard times. But that wasn't the whole story. Reaching for her magnifying glass, Margaret paused. The mother's face radiated pure love. But the boy, his expression was chilling. He stared straight ahead with an intensity that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face. His small hands, which should have been relaxed in his mother's embrace, hung stiffly at his sides. It was a calculated, unnervingly mature look. Margaret jotted in her log, "Unusual family photograph. Recommend further investigation." She had no idea this single image was about to unlock a mystery buried for over 90 years. A secret that would challenge everything we think we know about family. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving to the Victorian home of Eleonora Hartwell, the woman who donated the photo. Eleonora had recently passed away at 97, leaving behind a perfectly organized estate. Her great-niece Sarah greeted Margaret at the door. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleonora's collection," she said, leading Margaret through rooms that felt like a time capsule. Eleonora had dedicated her life to preserving her family's story, believing that photographs are windows into souls, revealing truths people prefer to keep hidden. In her study, Sarah handed Margaret a leather-bound journal. "This might interest you," she said. Aunt Eleonora's notes on that 1931 photograph. She spent years trying to understand it. Margaret opened the journal. One entry immediately caught her eye. "The boy in Mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? The truth about Thomas must be somewhere in these photographs." "Thomas?" Margaret asked. "Who was Thomas?" Sarah's expression darkened. "That's the problem. We're not entirely sure." She explained that growing up, she heard whispers about a boy named Thomas who lived with her great-great-grandmother, Ruth. Some said he was Ruth's son who died of influenza. Others claimed he wasn't her child at all. A few even insisted Thomas never existed. What did Eleonora believe? Margaret pressed. Sarah pulled out a second photograph from a manila envelope. It was taken a few months after the first one. It showed Ruth standing alone in front of the farmhouse, looking haunted. The boy was gone. Margaret turned the photo over. Faded ink read, "After Thomas left us, may God forgive what we allowed to happen." A shiver went down her spine. "Left, but the family said he died." "Exactly," Sarah replied grimly. "That's when Aunt Eleonora realized our family had been hiding something for a century." Then, Sarah retrieved a third photograph, one found hidden behind a mirror. It was dated just 2 weeks before the first picture. It showed Ruth with a completely different boy, lighter-haired, smiling genuinely. The resemblance between Ruth and this child was undeniable. This, Sarah said quietly, was Ruth's actual son, James. He died of pneumonia just days after this photograph was taken. The mystery deepened. If James was her real son, then who was the unsettling boy in the famous photograph? The boy they called Thomas. And what did the family do that required God's forgiveness? The photographs held the key, and Margaret was determined to unlock the truth. With copies of the photographs and Eleonora's notes, I returned to Washington, my mind racing. What was the story behind these images? The next morning, I met my colleague, Dr. James Patterson, a specialist in photographic authentication, at his lab. I laid the pictures on his desk. "James, I need you to examine these. I want to know everything: paper, chemicals, any signs of tampering." James was a meticulous researcher, known for solving historical mysteries through document analysis. He placed the first photo, the one with the dark-haired boy, under a high-powered digital microscope. "Interesting," he murmured. "The photograph is authentic. The paper and chemical composition match 1931 techniques. But there's something unusual about the image quality." I leaned in closer. "What do you mean?" He pointed to the monitor. "See this area around the boy's face? The grain structure is slightly different. It's subtle, but it suggests this part of the photo might have had additional processing." He switched to the second photograph, of Ruth standing alone. "This one shows no irregularities," he said. A straightforward image from the era. But when James examined the third photo, Ruth with her biological son, James's tone changed. "Margaret, you need to see this." He overlaid the two images of Ruth on his computer screen, adjusting them slightly. "Look at the background, the fence posts, the shadows, the farmhouse. They're nearly identical." This meant the photos were taken from almost the same spot. But more importantly, he continued, zooming in on Ruth's dress, "See this small tear near her left shoulder, and this scuff on her shoe. These details appear in both photographs." He looked at me, his eyes wide with discovery. "Based on the physical evidence, the clothing, the lighting, her hairstyle, these images were likely taken on the same day, possibly within hours of each other." My heart pounded. This was a huge breakthrough. Armed with this new information, I traveled to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwell family had lived. The small farming town still kept its Depression-era records in a modest town hall. There, I met Mary Kowalski, the town clerk. She was in her 70s and her grandfather had been the town doctor in the 1930s. Ruth Hartwell, Mary said thoughtfully, pulling out dusty record books. Oh yes, I remember stories about her. My grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Sweet boy, but sickly from birth. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1931. Broke poor Ruth's heart. I showed her the photographs. Mary studied them, her expression growing puzzled. This is definitely Ruth, she said, pointing. And this boy, she indicated the photo of Ruth with her son, looks just like the Hartwell family. Same sandy hair, gentle expression. But when Mary looked at the first photograph, the one with the dark-haired boy, her face darkened. This child, I don't recognize him at all. And I knew every family in this area back then. We all looked out for each other's children. She paused, studying his face. There's something about his eyes, unsettling. Almost as if he's older than he appears. Mary walked to a filing cabinet and pulled a folder marked 1931 birth and death records. She ran her finger down a handwritten list. James Hartwell died February 15, 1931. She confirmed, but here, S strange. There's no record of any other child living with Ruth that year. No adoption papers, no temporary custody, nothing. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed with concern. According to our official records, after James died, Ruth Hartwell lived alone on that farm until she moved away later that year. But your photographs suggest otherwise. A chill ran down my spine. The official story and the photographic evidence were in direct conflict. Is there anyone else in town who might remember those days? I asked, desperate for another lead. Mary thought for a moment. Frank Morrison. He's 94 now, lives at the assisted living facility. A living witness, he was my last hope to uncover the truth of what happened on that farm in 1931. The story was far from over. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the rest of this investigation. His family owned the farm next to the Hartwells. If anyone would remember a strange boy living with Ruth, it would be Frank. The Millfield Assisted Living Center was a modest, well-kept facility on the outskirts of town. Frank Morrison sat in his wheelchair by a large window overlooking a garden, his mind still sharp despite his advanced age. When Margaret showed him the photographs, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Dear God," he whispered, hands trembling slightly as he held the image of Ruth with the dark-haired boy. "I never thought I'd see that child's face again." Margaret pulled up a chair. "You remember him?" Frank nodded slowly. "Thomas. That's what Ruth called him, though I always suspected it wasn't his real name. He appeared at Ruth's farm shortly after young James died, maybe a week or two later. Ruth was nearly mad with grief, and suddenly there was this boy. Where did he come from? Nobody knew for certain. Ruth said she was caring for him temporarily, that his family was going through hard times. But," he paused, eyes distant with memory, "there was something deeply wrong with that child." Frank described how Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were far too sophisticated for his apparent age. He stared at people with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable and seemed to know things he shouldn't. Private details about neighbors, events that had happened before he supposedly arrived in Millfield. The animals didn't like him. Frank continued, "My family's dog would whimper and hide whenever Thomas was around. Even Ruth's old milk cow became agitated when he approached. Animals sense things, you know." Margaret showed Frank the photograph of Ruth standing alone. "What happened to Thomas?" Frank's expression darkened. "He disappeared one night in late summer, 1931. Ruth never spoke of it, but the next morning she was different. Relieved, but haunted. She moved away within a few months and never returned to Millfield. Did anyone report him missing? That's the strangest part," Frank said. "Nobody seemed to care. It was as if the whole town had decided to forget he ever existed. Even Ruth acted as though he had never been there." He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you something I've never told another living soul. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was walking past Ruth's farm and saw her in the backyard, digging deep into the ground behind the barn, working through the night by lantern light." Margaret immediately contacted Sarah Morrison after speaking with Frank. Together, they drove to Kansas to locate the original Hartwell farm, abandoned since the 1950s but still standing on land now owned by a local farming corporation. The current landowner, Robert Jensen, a practical man in his 60s who had grown up hearing stories about the cursed Hartwell place, welcomed him. He even provided ground-penetrating radar. He used to check irrigation lines. The farmhouse was in ruins. Its roof had collapsed years ago, and weather had worn much of the wooden siding away. The stone foundation remained intact, and the old barn Frank mentioned still stood. Its faded red paint, now a rusty brown. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning walking the property, matching photographs to the landscape. Despite decades of neglect, they identified the exact spot where Ruth had posed with both boys, a slight rise in the ground, offering a clear view of the house. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn. Margaret reminded Sarah as they approached the weathered structure. The area was overgrown with tall grass and weeds, but the radar could detect disturbances in the soil. Robert Jensen arrived around noon with his equipment, a large, lawnmower-like device with a display screen showing underground features. Slowly, he moved it across the area behind the barn. "There," he said suddenly, stopping the machine. "Something's definitely buried here." About 4 feet down, roughly rectangular, Margaret's heart raced. "How big?" Robert studied the screen. "About the size of a large suitcase." Or, he hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "It could be a small casket." Sarah gripped Margaret's arm. "You don't think there's only one way to find out?" Margaret said grimly. "We need to call the sheriff. If there's any chance human remains are buried here, it must be handled properly." As they waited, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling they were about to uncover a truth the Hartwell family and, perhaps the entire town of Millfield had tried to bury for 90 years. The wind picked up across the abandoned farm, whistling through the broken windows of the farmhouse and rustling the tall grass. In that sound, Margaret almost imagined hearing a child's voice, not the innocent laughter of youth, but something far more unsettling. The wind whistled across the abandoned farm as Sheriff David Martinez arrived within the hour, accompanied by the county coroner and a forensic team from the state police. Martinez, a seasoned officer, had seen his share of unusual cases, but the idea of investigating a potential 90-year-old crime scene was unlike anything in his experience. "We need to be extremely careful," Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic anthropologist, explained as her team prepared equipment. "If there are human remains, they'll be fragile after all this time, and if this is connected to a crime, we must preserve any evidence that might still exist." The excavation began methodically, the team removing soil by hand as they reached the depth indicated by the ground-penetrating radar. Margaret and Sarah watched from a distance, both nervous and captivated by the careful process. After 2 hours, one technician called out, "I've got something." Dr. Chen knelt beside the site and brushed away dirt to reveal the corner of a small wooden box. As more soil was cleared, the outline of a handmade box became visible, roughly the size of a child's coffin, crudely built, the joints uneven and imperfect. "This wasn't made by a professional," Dr. Chen noted. "Someone built this quickly, probably under stress." Sheriff Martinez documented the scene as the box was lifted carefully from the ground. A simple latch, weathered but intact, secured it. "Before we open this," Martinez said, addressing the team, "understand the gravity of what we might find. If these are human remains, we could be looking at evidence of a crime from 1931. Everything must be handled with proper forensic protocol." Dr. Chen opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white cloth but now stained brown, lay the remains of a small human skeleton. As she gently moved the cloth, her expression shifted from professional focus to confusion. "This is unusual," she said. "The bones show abnormal development. The skull suggests this individual was far older than the size would indicate, possibly an adult with severe developmental abnormalities." Or, she studied the remains with a magnifying glass. "Or what?" Martinez asked. "I've never seen anything like this. The bone density and structure suggest someone chronologically much older than their physical size. And look at the skull. The teeth are fully adult, but the skull is child-sized." While the forensic team continued their analysis, Margaret received a call from James Patterson at Georgetown University. "Margaret, based on your description of the skeletal remains, I think we may be looking at progeria or a similar premature aging syndrome," James said. Margaret, unfamiliar with the condition, listened as James explained. Progeria is an extremely rare genetic disorder causing rapid aging in children, resulting in the physical appearance of an elderly person in a child's body. In 1931, such conditions were virtually unknown. "Here's what's fascinating," James continued. "I found a 1930 case study of a child named Timothy Walsh, who disappeared from a state facility in Nebraska. He had an advanced form of progeria and behavioral abnormalities that made him extremely difficult to manage." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle click together. "What kind of abnormalities?" she asked. "The records indicate Timothy had the mental capacity and emotional awareness of an adult trapped in a deteriorating child's body. He was manipulative, calculating, and could exploit adult emotions in ways that would have seemed supernatural in the 1930s. Margaret realized Ruth Hartwell hadn't faced anything paranormal, just a profoundly ill child whose condition made him appear otherworldly to anyone unfamiliar with such rare disorders. "James, can you send me copies of those records? I think Timothy Walsh and the boy known as Thomas might be the same person." After hanging up, Margaret shared the revelation with Sarah. Suddenly, everything they had uncovered fit together. Ruth had been caring for a desperately ill child. Timothy's unsettling expression in the photograph reflected not malice, but the pain and confusion of a child trapped in a rapidly aging body. Ruth had acted out of compassion, protecting him in life and death. 3 weeks later, Margaret and Sarah stood in Ilalonina Hartwell's study. Having pieced together the full story from medical records, town documents, and Ilalonina's notes, the forensic analysis confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child approximately 10 years old chronologically, but with bones and dental structure of someone much older. DNA testing, limited by the age of the remains. Matched samples from the Walsh family, strongly suggesting Thomas was indeed Timothy Walsh. Eleanor had suspected the truth. Sarah read from her great-aunt's final notes. Ruth saved that poor boy from a lifetime of institutional suffering. When his pain ended, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great personal risk. Margaret arranged for Timothy Walsh to be reburied at Millfield Cemetery with a proper headstone, approved by both the Walsh descendants in Nebraska and the Hartwell family. It simply read, Timothy Walsh, 1920 to 1931, a child who suffered too much, finally, at peace. The 1931 photograph now made perfect sense. Ruth's maternal love had been genuine. She had cared for a desperately ill child who had nowhere else to go. Timothy's unsettling expression was the product of his extraordinary condition, not malice. Margaret concluded Ruth was a hero. In an era when people would have feared Timothy, she saw past appearances to the suffering child beneath, giving him comfort in life and dignity in death. The photograph, once unsettling, now told a story of compassion, tragedy, and the quiet bravery of one woman who acted with kindness despite fear. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, what feels wrong is simply something we do not yet understand.